So when Hildegund invited me, she said, "Can you please talk about global curating?" And I said, "Sure." And I sent the abstract. I got back this frantic mail. What does this mean? This has nothing to, what? No, she's much too polite to say this has nothing to do with global curating, but this is probably what she thought, you know, how does a museum and a school, and especially when you read my abstract, how does that somehow relate? And I'll just read the abstract to you quickly, because not all of you might have read it. It is the following. In the past 15 years, Western-type museums have expressed a new interest in expanding their public beyond the scope of an educated middle class. But studies show that despite innovative educational programs and contemporary approaches to audience building, little has changed in terms of equal access to the pleasure and knowledge contained in museums. In this light, might it be the right step to take the museum into the school? The lecture will look at practice-based research into this field, which takes its inspiration from a few examples of non-Western museum practice. Now, in case people have not stopped their cell phones, I would truly appreciate if you turned them off, or at least turn them low. It's really hard to keep the energy when there's so many electronic sounds. Of course, when you write an abstract, you have all this idea of what you're going to write, and then you start to write and things change, so bear with me in case I don't answer these questions of the abstract. There's time to discuss afterwards. And the lecture will have 6 parts. They're not all equally long, and there are parts where I'm trying to improvise a bit, so also bear with me. Some parts I will read, and others I will just talk freely. So, when Hildegund said, so what does this mean? You know, we are asking for a lecture on global curating. I started thinking, and the first question that came to my mind is, where is the global? Because similarly to the term contemporary, the term global is a lazy abstraction. If we really want to grasp its meaning, we might start by attempting to define it. Maybe like this: the global spans the whole territory of our planet. But immediately we run into problems. Territory is not a neutral term. A territory only appears through its ownership, its borders, the network and traffic that happens on it, the way it is used and sustained by the people who inhabit it, and so on. Think of yesterday Lucas' 2 roads through the territory of Kamchatka. And what this means for how it appears as a territory, you know, that there's only these 2 roads through it. But think also of the post-colonial theory that has, of course, dealt with this very eloquently in the 80s and 90s, so this is not a new discourse, and a critique of this phantom of globality is also not a new thing. And just in case there are students here who are interested in reading up on that, I can really recommend a feminist theoretician called Gayatri Spivak. And if you're interested in looking up where this discourse has gone since the 90s, probably you would search for mostly the feminist materialist, new materialism theory. And just to give you a very short, superficial definition of that, which I just Googled, it is: with the changing of societies on local, national, and international scales, owing to economic, ecological, political, and technological developments and crises, a reorganized academic landscape can be observed to be emerging. Scholarship strives to become increasingly interdisciplinary in order to grasp and examine the unfolding complexity of ongoing ecological, sociocultural, and political economic changes. And someone I can recommend very much, because she's an interesting writer and interesting artist, but she does a lot of theory, is a woman called Rachel O'Reilly. She even has a website with text on it, so you can easily Google her. And what she's trying to do is to take infrastructure and extraction more than not just as metaphors, but actually as tools through which she's thinking issues. And it's a very weird thing, extraction. She deals a lot with fracking and the exploitation, the way that biopolitics and the exploitation of the land, of the territory are somehow connected. And from a feminist point of view, this has to do both with what is being done to the planet, but also to do with labor. And but to use this not just as a content, but to use this as a kind of language through which things are thought, it's a kind of mind-boggling, a new way of thinking, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around, but I think it's quite interesting and inspiring. So I believe that if we want to truly address issues of the global, these are the ways that we need to do it. However, when the global is paired with curating, especially with curating contemporary art, that is, when we enter the discourse of the contemporary art industry, the global more often than not stands in for the non-Western. It is a euphemism, even a falsehood, increasingly used to cover over the highly complex ways that the systems of art production and reception have changed alongside the changing of societies on local, national, and international scales owing to economic, ecological, political, and technological developments and crises. I do not want to go into this more tonight, though it would, for instance, be interesting to analyze the recent trend to appoint non-Western curators to Western Biennale directorships. Does this point towards a long-due commitment of Western institutions to start decolonizing themselves? Or are other less savory factors at play? By asking this, I do not want to preclude the interpretation that it is because Gabi Kobo or Natasha Ginvala or Koyo Kuo or Inti Guerrero have fought hard to gain these positions and are super qualified to do the jobs, simply better than many of the Western colleagues. But you have to imagine there were always people super qualified who are non-Western, so why is it that now suddenly people do gain access? Again, this is not a question I will answer, I'm just posing it here. I'm not so interested in this because I'm more interested in my own practice. Tonight, I simply want to point to the ambiguity of claiming the right to represent or even talk about global curating. The only way I know how to do this is to radically situate myself in this position of ambiguity and to speak of a situated, personal kind of knowledge. That was my first part, so now comes the second part. What about the second header of my talk, my title, A Museum in a School? When I tell people about this plan of mine to make a museum in a school, they say, yes, I know this. I know of this museum. This just had a conference on museum school cooperations and that educational program that is truly revolutionizing the museum. And I reply, good for them. These activities are needed, but that's not what I mean. Indeed, the idea of school, something that used to be very boring, has become sexy. In artistic practice, the pedagogical turn has materialized in the popularity of lecture performances. Curators and institutions are looking back at utopian models of school, going as far as Marcelo Resenji, the former director of the Mamba in Salvador da Bahia, who between 2012 and 2015 set out to re-envision architect Lina Bobardzi's idea from the end of the 50s to conceive of the museum as a school. Hisenji was promptly fired from his job for trying to turn his museum into a school. But others, so for instance, Bach, who just had in Utrecht, who had a huge exhibition about 1970 schools, or the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, the House of the Cultures of the World in Berlin. They had a huge symposium on these topics, are doing quite well with this. Is it okay not to flash when you're taking a photograph, because I'm getting a headache from it? Thank you. Now we might ask about we might ask about the difference between school and education. A cynic might describe this as a simple difference in position. When a practice comes out of the field of art education, a field with relatively little symbolic capital, it has a harder time to gain substance institutionally than when artists and curators supported by art institutions adopt it. The power to call educational practice a school comes from above. So to sum up, the contemporary framework of my museum in a school, you have a pedagogical turn in the discourse of contemporary art that has to do with artistic practice, but also the way that this is now suddenly interesting for institutions, both interesting for educational institutions and art exhibition institutions. Institutions like Tate or Stedelijk are venturing into the field of education economy, creating their own and costly curatorial academies or art education courses. And then you have it as formal for the discourse, and the latest example is Learning from Athens, the motto of Documenta 14. And learning and unlearning are terms that are used frequently. And there are multiple reasons for this, which I don't want to go into too deeply. It has to do with the way that performance has become a mainstream medium. It also has to do with the way that the art industry is always looking for the newest trend and is almost parasitically mimicking discourses or practices from other fields. It also has to do with the earnest understanding of the dire need to educate one's public, now that the core public, the European bourgeoisie, is diminishing. So I'm not saying that this is only cynical, it's also because institutions are understanding that they need to do something. And it is connected with this new interest in the public. So institutions are starting to be more interested in their publics. So in the past 15 years, I think this has happened. Western-type museums have expressed a new interest in expanding their public beyond the scope of an educated middle class, which is diminishing. But studies show that despite innovative educational programs and contemporary approaches to audience building, little has changed in terms of equal access to the pleasure and knowledge contained in museums. One of these studies is done by a woman called Victoria Walsh. It's already 5 years old, and it was done by Tate. Tate sponsored this study, but then didn't want to publish it because the outcome was not to their pleasure. When they really found out that one of the reasons why this is, even though they're doing a lot and it's a very advanced educational program, this is not creating a new public, is that there's a conflict in the briefs of the curatorial team and what they're supposed to do in the museum, and the educational team, what they're supposed to do. And as long as this conflict is not resolved internally, they're not going to change it. But another reason is that still many institutions don't think of their public as a resource, a body that they can learn from. They're still thinking of their public as a body that needs to be educated and needs to be, so it's a very top-down approach. And for instance, in London, where this study was done, there's now a long migrant cosmopolitanism, and these people just couldn't care less when Tate addresses them as people to be educated. Another reason why institutions are interested in that is because they're forced more and more to prove their impact. So the funding bodies, especially in governments, when it comes to public institutions, are asking institutions to prove impact. And sometimes, there are even impact managers now. And I once went to a conference in Bristol at Arnolfini Galerie, and a week later I got this 26-page survey that showed what kind of impact my talk had. They did, and they interviewed, some people had to fill out some forms, and they basically, it came down to very little information, but they managed to display this information on 26 sides, pages with many graphs and and this is kind of a whole person is doing this job for the museum or the gallery because the government is asking for this, So, and of course, I would say as an educator and a curator that the criteria to prove this impact are the wrong ones, because a lot of the effects of art cannot be proved immediately. You might see something or learn something or be confronted with something that only has an impact years and years later. So it's pretty ridiculous, but it's become a business. The other reason why there's this interest in the public is because the governments, as in Europe, as they have started to disband the welfare system, are trying to find other bodies than the ones that we are used to, that are somehow socializing their citizenry into a kind of homogeneous cohesion. And they're looking to museums to do this. And in Germany, the term for that is cultural education. So a few years ago, something like 15 years ago, the state discovered cultural education as at least in a fiction, I think it's a bit of a myth, of something that will help with, for instance, integration of migrants. So somehow art is supposed to be better at integrating migrants than giving migrants the right to vote. Yeah. So there is a bit of I'm a bit polemic here, but there is a bit of a problem with this because one of the problems is that already in this art education there's a lot of governmentality integrated. So there's so certain experiments cannot be done anymore because it's supposed to be pro-democracy, building new citizenship. And the other problem with that is, despite the fact that the government has suddenly found a policy of cultural education, the money that is put into this is very little. So that the people who are actually working in the sector are all quite exploited, and there's only so much you can do in it. There are a lot of good menschen, including me. At this point, I'd like to tell you something about this image behind me, which you were supposed to have been looking at the whole time, but I forgot to put it on. Actually, it's a rather small painting. It's only about this big. Yeah. And it's by a painter called Dirk Schmidt, and it's part of a larger series. And it's from 2002. Now it is at the Städel Museum in Frankfurt, this whole series. The series is called Sieve X. It does look rather sunny, a seascape, unless you see it in its context, in which Dirk Schmidt addresses the unholy fraternity of art history and nationalism. It kind of also attaches to Lucas's talk, going from landscape to seascape. So CFX is an acronym used in a cover-up by the Australian government at the beginning of this century. It stands for Suspected Illegal Entry Vessel X and refers to a boat with 397 refugees from Indonesia, which sank off the Australian coast on October 19, 2001. So it sank within the waters that are controlled by the Australian Navy, and it shouldn't have sunk. So long before this now so-called refugee crisis that we are referring to here in Europe, there are boats of people escaping that have sunk before. And for me, this is a very important picture. It's, as I said, 15 years old, but I think it's very powerful for me because it doesn't show this directly, this problem. I mean, it does show it if you know it, but it doesn't. It's not immediately decipherable, and it's one of the examples of what I think that art can do. I wonder if the refugees on the boat had survived, would they be going into the museum to watch, for instance, the William Kentridge animation? And why should they? That's my second part. Now comes my third part. Roundabout when the West started to prove unable any longer to uphold a myth of its own centrality, people began to think about what this might mean for exhibition making. A few years of experimentation followed. Some of it was timid, some radical, but all shared the insight that in order for the principles of justice and solidarity to take hold, more than the content of exhibitions would have to be changed. We'd also need to start the difficult process of refiguring exhibition formats and reception modes. There were a number of methods and tools I and Roger Bürgel employed in the curating of Documenta 12 in 2007 to refigure this status quo. And we didn't just try to refigure it in relation to the West, non-West problem, but that's the one I'm going to focus on here. As this is not a lecture on the making of Documenta, I'll be extremely cursory. And the reason I do mention this at all is not because I'm particularly narcissistic, but I'm somewhat pained at the amnesia that seems to be a staple of art industry's discourses on exhibition making, despite now the newly discovered discipline of the history of exhibitions. The shifting of the Western canon started, I don't think with ours, I think it started in terms of Documenta. It started with Catherine David's Documenta, and both in terms of the representation of female and queer artists, and in terms of Asian participation, Documenta 12 had a higher percentage than the ones that followed it. Textile was first shown on a larger scale in Documenta 12, and I think it's the first time, except if you look at this, and I can't think of the name, Erika Billet? No, who was it? There was a woman who made a soft sculpture exhibition in the 70s in Switzerland. Does anyone know? But aside from that, textile was pretty much excluded from contemporary exhibitions until we showed it in 2007. I mean, there are always artists who have been interested in producing textiles, of course. And showing old art in this radicality with the contemporary canon was a new thing that we did. And we were severely criticized for it. An emphasis on education as a subject and integral part of exhibition making was also quite important for Documenta 12. And we did put our money where our mouth was in this respect. I will also not go into it because it's not the topic of this. So in terms of, when we're thinking about how we would have to change exhibition making, or at least exhibition display, if we were going to address this question of art that comes from another than the Western modernist canon, another history, We pretty early on understood that one aspect that would need to be challenged was the white cube, and of course we're not the first one to understand this, and there had been since the 80s and 90s a lot of criticism of white cube curating. It's certainly not a neutral form of curating, and because it's not neutral, Ockrey and Weser in Documented 10 did do white cube curating, because for him it was really important to give the respect to artists that hadn't been shown in this respectful context, so he kind of tried to kind of level this by showing everything in white cube. But there was a problem that we learned a lot from that, was a problem that it actually didn't challenge the geopolitical identification of those that were not Western. So what happens is, because you're used to the audience, which is at that time was still also mainly a Western audience, because this audience is used to minimal art and conceptual art and understands its discourses, but is maybe not used to batik that comes from Indonesia. The batik gets identified, or the artist working with batik gets identified as an Indonesian artist without there being much knowledge about what that would mean and entail, and without understanding the context. And Weser tried to counter this by producing a lot of discourse. If you do remember, there were, five platforms beforehand that produced were supposed to produce the foundation on which this exhibition would be perceived. But even if you do that, it's not enough. There's more knowledge that you need to have, and not one single person has all this knowledge. Moreover, we thought we would have to find a way to stay within the medium of the exhibition, because we cannot assume that the people who come have time or the knowledge and the money to buy all these catalogs and read it. So we thought we would have to get rid of this easy identification of, on the one hand, some art as being particular to certain artistic discourses, and the other being particular to its geopolitical context. And so we thought this can only be done if we're also defamiliarizing the given canon, so that we would be showing Western artists, but we would show them as radically local artists, so that they would also be localized. We also understood that we would have to openly acknowledge the impossibility to overcome ignorance with just one exhibition. Also because the research in many cases had not been done yet. So the further away you go, the less infrastructure is there. From the kind of economic power centers, the less money is there for art historical research, for art critical research. So for instance, at that time, even though there was such a vast production of Chinese contemporary art, there was hardly any art criticism that was on the same level as art criticism here. So that actually we did certain things that made quite clear that there was knowledge missing, and it especially made the art critics quite angry, and the art historians and the professionals quite angry that this was missing. But we thought, okay, we cannot, even if we were writing many texts about every work, it's not enough to really understand. So understand the work that has been decontextualized. So what to do? We thought that the principle would be to give the works new contexts. So that doesn't mean that they're devoid of the meaning that is somehow missing, but that you can at least give them another level of meaning. And for this we adopted something that we called the migration of form. And the migration of form was on one hand a historical principle, and on the other hand a phantasmatic principle, a kind of invested narrativity. Historically, this is relevant because actually there have been connections that are much older than our globalization, because of course the world was connected through trade and travel. So that there are a lot of migrations of form that have just not been researched, or at that time, 10 years ago, had not been researched. But actually now this is a research that is being done. Again, this often isn't research because often research is just very nation-based. Art history is very nation-based, so that the interconnections between what comes from, I mean, just think of the Dutch blue and white china that actually comes from China, but we associate the blue and white with the Dutch. Our world has for a long, many hundreds of years been globalized, and this has had an effect of the forms that we use. So we, on one hand, we try to show this, and that's one of the reasons why we showed historical art like this one. And on the other hand, we try to kind of create artificial rhizomatic connections between the work, between the works, and so that in the absence of their original context, the exhibition could supply another kind of context, which would make another kind of sense not based on knowledge and objectivity. So we do derive much of what constitutes a culture from trade, migration, even occupation, and colonialism. Consider this Persian drawing from the 14th century. While the naturalist landscape recalls the visual language of Persian art, two elements stand out as if pasted and copied. Colorful shapes looking almost like dragons, and a river rippled with what can be characterized as Chinese waves. Though not naturalistic, the river is perfectly readable as a river. But the colorful shapes remain enigmatic as long as one is looking for their pictorial function. They're rocks transported from Chinese art into a new context in the guise of pure forms. While the waves are doing their job, perfectly integrated as they are, the rocks demonstrate the fascination the artist must have felt coming upon the singularly strange shape. The attempt to appropriate this shape alters the overall appearance of other more familiar elements, the trees and the river, which start to look quite singular as well, like a kind of alien landscape. This transmission of form can be traced from a century, from 2056 to 12,056 to 1353, in which Greater Iran was ruled by the Ilkhanids, a Mongolian dynasty who first opposed and later adopted Islam. With this work, we placed a second Persian drawing for keeping the first one company, an ally of sorts. And we also installed two sculptures, Prototype for the Wave, 2004 by Ai Weiwei, as well as the Droginas from 1966 by Mira Schendl. And here's maybe a nicer picture of Mira Schendl handling her Droginas. Looking at Ai Weiwei's wave, the similitude between its shape and the Chinese waves in the Persian drawing is striking. Formal innovation was never really an issue in traditional Chinese art, and this relative conservatism informs the piece. However, it would be a mistake to imagine a seamless migration of form across 7 centuries, since Ai Weiwei was taking up the traditional form in a gesture of interruption. Critical of the costs of the current wave of Chinese modernism, a wave that forced itself upon society with the might of a tsunami, and aware of the hopelessness of any individual activity against the tide, the artist continues to engage in an artistic practice that tries to sustain traditional craftspeople and their vanishing skills. The porcelain wave is but one of many works resulting from this quirky job creation scheme. Mira Schendl's Droginas seem a world apart. The little nothing, this is the Portuguese meaning of Droginas, are objects made from rice paper that have been twisted and kneaded into a rope and then woven into knots, forming nets, balls, and plates. The pieces come in all kinds of shapes, changing appearance according to how they are handled, laid out, or hung. And in contrast to the other works, the droguinhas are non-referential. Yet there are subtle connections between them, be it the Asian quality of the material, the rice paper, be it the fragile thingness shared by the two sculptures, be it the way that the surface of the paper objects, which reminds one of unglazed ware, resonates with the smooth glaze of the porcelain. All three works depict movement or flow, but whereas the Persian drawing and the Iowa wave have caught the flow in one form, rendering water as a kind of dynamized materiality, Schendel's object keeps flowing, building up and collapsing energized matter. Now to my fourth chapter. 10 years after the fact, I'm still of the opinion that exhibitions can be a space in which transmission between artifacts from different cultural contexts and times is possible. Though I think the framework and rules of this transmission need to be negotiated anew every time, and even invented anew. In the art industry, I guess, this is why it's also difficult to express my concern about what I perceive to be happening in the art industry right now. There are so many good exhibitions done by people all over the planet, and I might be nagging about what might seem only the slightest of shifts, a nuance in curating. Nevertheless, I do think that today, a globalized art world has insidiously and pervasively swept away all the hard questions and established a curatorial rhetorics that will recognize but not act against the intricacies of the art world power relations, while shifting artworks like goods from one continent to another. So nowadays it's almost impossible to see a group show that doesn't include work from, even in Europe, work from elsewhere. And it seems somehow a given that this is possible, and without really doing that kind of negotiation and without really trying to find out anew what this means to put these works together. And actually, it's something that you could say about Western works as well. I mean, you could say it about any kind of group show. I think that there's very little thinking about this, that somehow people think they have found the model, and it's very much often a model that is discursive. So people are very reflexive when it comes to the post-colonial discourses and discourses of decolonization. And I personally feel that this is not mirrored in the way that the exhibitions themselves are made. And so I think it's time to start asking again what might resist this transnational trade of objects, people, and network. And here I come to my museum in a school. What might resist the transnational trade of objects, people, and works? I think the only thing, at least from my perspective, and I can only speak here from my perspective, I'm not excluding that there are other possibilities, is actually a radical translocality. And with this, I mean that I feel that it's really important to invest in local initiatives and do that as one is quite aware of and talking to people translocally. And so that one needs to make this connection constantly, but it's wrong just to think that you can just surf on this translocal network. I think you do need to be radically local. So there are a lot of very radical local museums all over the world, and I will just give you an example of one that has been very influential to my thinking. And this museum is called Acervo della Age. Salvador Lage is in Salvador da Bahia, which is a city in the mid to north east of Brazil. And Salvador was a city where it's a port city, and it's a city where most of the slaves that were distributed on that continent arrived from Africa. So it's at least 90% black, Afro-Brazilian, and it has many comunidades. Comunidade is the Brazilian contemporary term for what we used to call slums or favelas, but now they're called communities. And one of them is a comunidade called Plataforma, and this museum of Salvador Lage is in this comunidade called Plataforma. The guy who made it, Ginho, is someone who comes from this neighborhood and then studied sociology and psychoanalysis, and focused for a long time on abuse, sexual abuse in families, and got extremely depressed. And then his mentor said, "Why don't you focus on beauty?" And he then started to make this museum. And this museum collects works from the neighborhood. You wouldn't imagine how many artists there are in this neighborhood. So, and some of them are actually quite high priced nowadays. So they're living and coming from a comunidade, but they're actually their works function within an art economy. However, he's not just collecting these, and he's not making a separation between. There is no taxonomy in his museum. This is actually the archive of the museum, and the left picture is so weak in color because at the time when I first visited this museum, there was no electricity in the in the museum, so we didn't have a light bulb, and we flashed this. So this is how it looks, and here you see me with some of these material. He actually knows where what is, so he can pull out things, and what he pulls out is amazing. It's mind-blowing because it's very local, but he's very well connected internationally. So the letters he has from people that you will know by name are amazing, and people who have visited this museum are amazing. And it's quite interesting, this, because it kind of turns, I show you a picture of the collection, it kind of turns around the principle of value of what is art and what is non-art. It's not a museum that is just claiming that folk art is art. It's really a museum that's radically challenging our value system. So here you have a view of a museum. It's actually in the house of his sister, so below there live something like 8 people in a small room, and then on top of that there are several rooms of art. And these, for instance, are quite highly valued in Brazil, and the art market in Brazil. These shells are all collected by him. He also kind of salvages stuff from places that are ruined and somehow reintegrates it. So he's also a chronicler of this museum. And the museum is doing a lot of activities. It's called a Salvador Lage, which means collection on the rooftop, because actually a lot of life happens on the rooftops in comunidades, in these, so you see that on the top there. Because it's very hot there, so there's more air up there. This is a new building he built because his collection has gotten too big, so he needs more space, but also because he's made a residency, and so people come. There's actually urbanists who come and map the comunidade. There's all kinds of people who come there and do seminars, and this is actually my students and me when we came to visit this museum. Here's the inside of the seminar room. Here you have him actually showing us putting water on the tiles so we can see the tiles that he has salvaged and integrated into this new building. When Marcelo Hesenji, who's now, by the way, working for the Dresden Staatsgemäldesammlung, he's now the Sammlung Marcona. He's the head, one of the co-head director of this collection. So he's now since moved. But when he was doing his Bahia Biennale, which became quite well known amongst curators because of its avant-garde principles, when he was making it, Acervo da Laje was an outpost, so a lot of people came through this. A lot of museum directors from Europe have come and seen this museum and have been inspired by this museum. But it does function, so it has a translocal aspect, but it does function as part of the community, and it actually even integrates a school into this. Jeannie Wife teaches students from the age of 5 to the age of 18. It's an informal school, but it is nevertheless a school. From Acervo da Laje, I take inspiration in several ways, but amongst them is that I find this a very meaningful curatorial practice, and this is relevant to me because I'm of an age where my peers and colleagues are all getting very, very tired and dispirited. I know a lot of artists who've in the recent 5 years been telling me, I'd love to leave the art world, but I don't know where to leave to. You know, what's that reggae song? Stop the world, I want to get off. A bit like that. Of course, they want to continue with their practice, but they don't want to continue to produce for the art industry. They don't get the feedback that they need, so they don't get this. They are not sustained. They're not nurtured. So money is only one aspect of nurture. And I've been thinking about this a lot, also curators who are doing amazing jobs. The What, How, and For Whom collective, for instance, who did this Istanbul Biennale that brought tears to my eyes because it was so beautiful, who are just don't know how to go on. And it's not just a matter of precarity and money, it's really also a matter of how the system of production and dissemination works. And so I thought very long about this, you know, how to create an institution that would somehow help the people that I care for, and somehow enable another kind of practice. And so I thought that it would have to be an institution that would somehow connect to everyday life, as Acervo da Laje does. And the other thing that I truly believe is that I think that we need to teach the young ones, and that we need to somehow enable a future for them. So I decided that it might make sense to, instead of asking kids and migrants to come to the museum, why should they? To actually bring something to the school, because they have to spend time there anyways. Now, I don't want to do, of course there's a lot of art education happening already in schools, and I don't want to do projects in school, because it kind of is very hard for projects to enable people to really take agency. And I do believe in the principle of a museum. My experiences with museums are amazing, and I'm quite classical and traditional in this, you know, taking care of objects, exhibiting objects, researching objects, collecting objects, I think are really necessary cultural practices. And I think that they could be done in a school as well. So, for instance, if kids were to have, you know, get a pot of money every year, and you can do that very easily, to collect one work of art for the school that would then go into the public school. I think that would be possible, and I'm imagining this similar to the way that actually a children's jury is selecting at the Berlin Film Festival. It's very, very interesting. The children's jury at the Berlin Film Festival makes such qualified choices, because they're also enabled to do so. So there are people who are mediating this process, and it's quite serious. So that it's a error to think that you need to become populist to do something like that. It's an error to think that you need to do this baby talk. But if you think of a little Turkish girl who's gonna be on a jury to select a work of art, I think this girl is gonna have a different connection to this work than if she's not been the one to buy it. There's another aspect to this, which has to do with what in the left now is called economic democracy. Now, the left has at least in Europe, there are people like Alex Demirovic, who is a professor at Frankfurt, who's on YouTube with stuff like that, has decided that they're not so against the economy anymore as they used to be, but they're against the monopolies. So they're talking about the way to democratize economy. And I was thinking about this, and after a conversation I had with gallerists who were saying that it used to be very different. There used to be really quirky collectors who would work very weird kind of art. So galleries had a chance also to do something for artists that didn't fit in the mainstream. Nowadays, there is a monopoly of galleries. There are very, very few who are really economically viable, and they were complaining. These gallerists were complaining that the new generation of collectors only want to buy the same 200 artists, the blue chip art, and that there is even within the marketplace not a possibility anymore to have a more heterogeneous point of form of art. Now, I was somehow tying these two together and thinking, okay, so then maybe it's also important to educate a new form of collectorship. Why should only the rich people collect art and also learn to collect art? So these are some of these ideas, and the way I thought to go about this is not to apply for some kind of state funding to do research and do this, because of some of the reasons I already told you. Because the moment you apply for the state funding, there is a certain kind of governmentality implied in this. And Lucas was also having this experience when he was making this early show, where the principle of governmentality was quite harshly and ended in censorship. But there are all kinds of soft forms of censorship, and be it that if with state funding you have to spend a lot of energy just proving your impact or making your budget and making all your receipts and so on, so that people spending so much time for the application and so on, all without being really paid well. So the energy I'd rather concentrate my energy in doing the things that I really want to do. But that means that I somehow at this point need to do them without money. So I'm kind of doing very slow research, where I'm using the aspect of serendipity and occasions that come across my way to do this kind of research. This means that there are a few problems with my research. It's a counterfactual research because the research itself is project-based, whereas my argument is that I need I need a museum because I need this kind of sustained and long engagement in a school. So this hasn't been solved yet, but that's just how I'm operating at this point. So the first one I did, the first museum in a school is not this one. This is from Salvador, but was in a school in Berlin, which has a majority of migrant kids. And I attached myself to a kind of summer school that was done for the kids who were not going on holidays by the school, and involving a lot of local artists who have done this initiative And I asked a few young artists, you can see them here, to help me with envisioning, conceiving what this kind of museum in a school would be, and to discuss its problems and practices. We ended up doing an exhibition called Gedankenreisen, and we decided not to use artworks because it just at that point was too difficult to do, but instead we used maps that we found in the cellar. They're old maps, and that we found in the cellar, and the artists kind of made a display with these maps so you could legitimate that it's art because artists did it. But, so here we're showing the kids one of these maps and prompting them to explain to us what's on the maps. We blackened out all the pieces that actually show what this map is about, and it's quite amazing what the kids said what this map was about. Interestingly, the one refugee kid could actually explain this map and recognize all the borders, whereas the other kids thought that the yellow actually meant this is where gold is. So we asked very few questions. The questions are, can you learn from a map? Are images maps? And are maps real? And these were the only questions we prompted the kids with, and then this is the exhibition. You can see the kids looking at the works and sometimes studying the works. And then we did workshops within that. This is a workshop with neighbors about how to find another relation than a discursive relation to objects, how to use the body to find a relation to objects. And there were certain things we learned from this. The one thing that we learned, and this is something that became more important in the next project I did, was that museums and even exhibition making and schools have very different institutional logics and contradictory timing, and that this needs to be resolved. This means that this is very hard because there's not just the curriculum that teachers need to teach, but all sorts of ways that makes it very difficult for schools to do something that's out of the curriculum. We also realized that because this was done basically with the director of the school, we realized that if you don't have the teachers, you won't get the parents. You might get the kids, but you won't get the parents. So that you really need to negotiate with teachers, and it's not enough to just have the okay of a director of a school to do something that works. And of course, one of the problems we had is that this was project-based, so it was only 3 weeks and not longer. My next iteration of this museum in a school was a few months later in Salvador da Bahia in Brazil. Again, the museum and the school was set up as an experiment. Young artists from Salvador and from the Dutch Art Institute were modeling a possible future institution by ways of making an exhibition at a school. And the activity had 3 parts. And the first one probably took the most energy and also the most time. And this was negotiating and workshopping with local stakeholders on the framework, on the concept, and on the content of a museum and a school. So I spent 1.5 months just talking to people there. So this is like local artists I talked to early on, and they then actually helped me very much, because also people don't speak English, so you need to somehow find ways of going around that. This is actually Ingenious Museum discussing these. These are my students negotiating and discussing this. This is when we went to the working class neighborhood and a school there. We had to wait for 6 hours for the director to appear. She was 6 hours late, and you see in the front, you see my son who just got too tired and fell asleep. So this is, something that you have to somehow, if you want to work like that, you have to wait 6 hours. There's just no way other way. So this is actually us again waiting for the teachers with one of the local a singer, Brazilian singer, Celia Mara, who also lives in Vienna, in case any of you know her. This is the director, and a woman who's part of a feminist group of mothers who are actually helping the school. So the way we got entered the school was by talking to local young artists who knew some of these mothers. Then we talked to the mothers and got them to agree that this makes sense. And then we talked to the director, and then we talked to the teachers. And in the end, my Dutch Art Institute students came and made workshops with the kids, and they had all the support of all these people. So the 3 students who actually went into this school had a support of something like 12 people around them who were translating, who were mediating. You see one of my students and the director in the back. This negotiation also meant, for instance, that I decided that Genius Museum or Salvador Lage, that there's one artist I really liked, and that it would make sense to maybe take these works out of Salvador Lage to look at it in a different way. And so I decided to make an exhibition, and I asked Felix, whom you see in the left, Felix Toro, to co-curate it. And this artist is actually a homeless. And he sells his work to tourists mostly. But at this point, when we wanted to see if he would be up to making an exhibition with us, we couldn't find him anymore. And people said, oh, he's been taken to a psychiatric hospital because he's quite ill, he's psychotic. So Felix took 2 weeks to find him. He found him somewhere outside of Salvador Bahia. And here we are with visiting him, where he's in his psychiatric hospital, living there right near the beach, and we're talking to him, about whether we could make an exhibition with his work, and he agreed if we paid him, which we did, and we made an exhibition with his work. Indiano Carioca is his name. It's quite amazing and beautiful work, and I put this work in a very famous building. This is a building by Lina Bobbaggi. It's a utopian building. You might have seen it in architectural books. It's built in Salvador da Bahia, but it's actually abandoned because the mayor of the city has his office next door, and the military police have cut off the street because of security reasons, because the mayor doesn't want to have to meet normal people on the street, or maybe he's afraid that some terrorists will come in any case, so you cannot access the street where this building is. So even though it's a public building, this building is mostly closed. And I negotiated with the help of Goethe Institute to open this building and make an exhibition in it. So here you have us setting this up. And what was quite amazing was that when we had the opening, people from Plataforma came, and because Indiano Carioca is also from Plataforma, and they had never been to this building, and it's really in the center of town, and they all cried because never ever had anything from Plataforma been shown in the center of town. So you see this kind of hierarchies that can be transgressed if you're a guest, if you're a foreigner. And then we went into the school. A little student made an invitation card, and this is our exhibition so we made an exhibition in the school with documentation of the workshops. Here's a game that an artist developed. It's a memory game that an artist developed for the kids. Here you see the kids playing. Here you see the memory game of the artist and a student talking about the exhibition, documentation. And in the end we made a symposium. There were other parts, but I won't go into that. We made a symposium with all the players and stakeholders, and we made this symposium at Quachi again, this utopian building. Here you see some of my students. And here you see the school kids who also came and represented the work they did with my students. And I will end with a little clip, very short clip, of a spontaneous performance by these kids. Ah. Sorry. For the moment, I'm satisfied with the ephemeral form of my research, despite the slightly contradictory nature of this museum exhibition, because I'm still learning, but also because the activities themselves make sense to the artists and the local stakeholders. Yet for the children to gain real agency in this endeavor, a proper institution will have to be set up. Eventually, they might not only use this museum as spectators, but join us in the core activities of a museum, taking care of the objects, exhibiting and mediating them, and yes, I plan to invite them to actually do the collecting. Obviously, this is conceived as an emancipatory project, but no emancipatory project can truly succeed unless its initiators seek to understand their own position of power and of desire within the process. My desire is to see works of art displayed in an actually meaningful way, so that all the children, the people interacting in the museum, and the works of art gain new agency. On my own position of power, let me just say, for the moment, I seek to gain some agency myself, not so much as a broker, but as someone who creates. And now for the sixth part, the finish. Connecting my thoughts on the problems of global curating and on a future museum in a school is the fact that both need a practice of radical translocality. Rather than surfing along the lines of existing networks and trade routes, we need the passion and the patience to forge and sustain meaningful relationships and negotiate and renegotiate the rules of sharing information, knowledge, learning, resources, inspiration, across localities. With all this implies conflict, solidarity, and I think that solidarity is not just giving something to others, but always includes divesting oneself of one's own privilege. This is a more painful part of solidarity. And friendship. Thank you.
I know that in the rural area, they took children, pupils for creating the operas. But I'm really don't know, is it really taking them into responsible for the jury? So they really want to have kids jury? Or do they treat them just to make them come back when they're older? Because it's always the average age of visitors in these cultural events are mostly 50 or 60 years old. So youngers are missing. Is it real interest in kids, or is it more we need younger people?
You know, I'm thinking almost that it might make sense just not to use the microphone, because what I'm getting back is an echo, and I can't really hear you.
When you told about the kids jury, I just know that we have this in rural area, Ruth Noack, they have kids jury. And I saw them, they were brought in, taken by big car, and I don't know if they're really taken for serious, or if they just used enough young people to come to this
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, there are ways of doing this right and there are ways of doing this wrong, let's say it like that. As always, with working with any group of audience, I think for me, one of the principles is, are you really interested in learning from kids? Are you really interested in their perspective? You know? We had my experience with about 50 young adults. The youngest was 12 and the oldest was 19, who we educated to become guides for Documenta. And this education to become guides for Documenta took a year, and they met twice a week. And they had workshops in psychology, and they had workshops in elocution. They had workshops in how to deal with rabid adults. Afterwards, some of them gave a lecture, and some adults, well-meaning adults, tried to treat them, you know, so how was this for you? Are you now very interested in art? And they basically said quite strongly that the reason they were interested in this is because it gave them a voice. It gave them a subject position, and that they weren't even so interested in art. But that to be put in a position where they could actually, because they guided adults, we didn't ask them to guide children because we thought, and youth, young people, because we thought this is really difficult to do. And so the kids guided the adults, and they really liked to have this position of where they could actually be the teachers. So I think there are, there are very many smart people who think about this, and I certainly think this can be done in a stupid way, and it can be done in a more interesting way.
Well, one thing I'm really thinking about is this very often used term of Western art.
Yeah.
I'm honestly not really sure what it means, because usually it is not reflected in the way of the self-limitation of this understanding, because it's usually a part of a kind of, historically, a result of an ideological conflict of East and West, and radically dominated our understanding of arts after World War II. And I don't know, or very little thinkers who really reflect this kind of Western art. If we reflect about, for example, Western modernity, what do we mean about that? It is a reflection of an understanding of after World War II. But I think it might be different, for example, of the understanding we had in the 20s. Yeah? What does this, for example, mean if we start afterwards discuss a relation to the colonies or to other continents? The same as, for example, in the understanding of art as art. What does it mean if we look to Christian icon paintings? Is this art, or is it today a kind of ready-made? Yeah? Because in the time when it was produced, it was not a thing. I think like contemporary art as we understand it today. Yeah? So, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
This is a basic problem I have with, you ask a question, use a term, but what is this term? Yeah? And how to answer it if you don't answer and define the term we use. Yeah? This is a problem from my point of view.
I think it's a problem that has been brought up by the very least, I mean, it's been brought up by many people for a long time. But one of the first people who've been, I mean, since the 80s,
I mean,
people are thinking about, are writing about this, and the whole so-called former West complex of people making exhibitions, making symposia about this, are reflecting this, you know, in the term of the former West. There are many people who are thinking about these, challenging, you know, challenging this term and reflecting on how its ideological specificity. A philosopher called Peter Osborne, who wrote a book on contemporaneity. It was, can anyone recall the title of it? Anywhere or not at all, is also making a similar argument about how this periodization of when the contemporary art starts is so ideologically based. So you have the idea that it starts after World War II. You have this idea that it starts in 1989. You have this, you know, they're different after the fall of the wall, and it of course, the canonical art stories that are written are extremely ideologically based. I don't feel that I need to define this here, because what I'm referring to is actually an exhibition practice that just assumes that these questions don't need to be asked anymore, and that, you know, contemporary exhibition practice that assumes that we are, you know, basically there's a kind of global balance that makes it possible just to put Rashid Areen next to some Aborigine artist without there being a problem in aesthetic language, in understanding these works, and so on. And so yeah.
But I understand it even on sometimes even on a deeper level. Yeah. For example, if we discuss the question about kitsch, and
about
kitsch, for example, and which is like Clement Greenberg, the avant-garde kitsch article, which is one of, I think, the most influential theoretical articles, and only how he used it and how he described paintings as the examples for kitsch who simply don't exist.
Yeah. But even if you don't take a kind of lower art form, if you take, in our exhibition that we dared, in Documenta, that we dared to show historical art, was considered a faux pas in this, you know, and the interesting thing is or to show so much textile. I mean, there were critics who wrote that there is not a single artist in our show who's of any quality. And a few years later, all of this is shown as if it was completely normal. Yeah. Of course, the moment that we are accepting into this idea of globality, I mean, when the first Documenta was founded, it was called an international exhibition. This internationality encompassed Italy, which was at that point really important, France, and then later the second one had the United States, but the first one also had, but not even that much. You know, international was German, French, and Italian. But the moment we're taking this very serious and beyond, let's say, the Western geography, of course there are different definitions of contemporary art and contemporary art practices. I mean, for me, it's already completely weird that people think that they can understand Chinese contemporary art. I mean, I've been in a jury of Chinese contemporary art every 2 years for the past 10 years. I don't understand it. It's really, really difficult to understand it. It's not it's a different idiom, it's a different practice that is different context, even though on the surface it looks like it's the same. Yeah. And there's another problem, which is that forms, and this is, I made a whole symposium on this problem, which is, and I think it's actually something we can use as a form of resistance, that forms might look the same, but they have actually different meanings. So what then happens if you take forms that look the same, like everything is a video, but that actually within their artistic context have a completely different meaning, which is also something that you riff on when you make a museum in I will never remember. Kamchatka. I mean, you riff on that, exactly this problem, that there is no easy translation. You know, you can't just, I mean, it's ridiculous, yeah, when you show the paintings to the bears. But so that it creates all sorts of problems, and these are very interesting problems, and it's of course necessary to do this. It's necessary to engage this. We can't just act as if we can show works from Berlin. That's not possible anymore. But we need, as curators, we need to find ways of dealing with that instead of covering it over with this kind of capitalist trade and capitalist networking.
Yeah, I also have a question. Ruth, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I guess a talk always resonates with what you yourself know and bring in as an experience background. So professionally, I'm closely linked to development work. So a lot of the things that you showed here, especially the project in Brazil, it reminded me of development work. So Entwicklungszusammenarbeit. And a lot of the trends that go on there and that I see on a daily basis. That means going in with also with a technical Western knowledge, and this approach of doing something for the beneficiaries, with the beneficiaries, empowering them, emancipating them, to then create something that has worth for themselves, a value. And I think in many cases this works very well, but in the end, because I'm very critical of this, I sometimes question myself, isn't what we end up with in the end then a Western institution nonetheless? And that was like a question that came into my mind. I mean, in the end, even like emancipating the people in Brazil, don't we end up in the end with a Western institution, with a museum, with creating all of these practices which might also have a Western origin? So in what sense can that be truly global then?
I'm not sure. Maybe I was really I'm creating misunderstandings, but I don't think I said any of this, of emancipating them. I don't think I did. I think I emphasized that I went there in order to learn, and I emphasized that I am actually learning from Marcelo de Lage, and it challenges this is my education, not theirs. There's also an assumption, which is, I think, only people in the West have, only in Europe have, that there are places that are not knowledgeable about Western structures. Of course. I mean, this museum functions. It's a museum. It's a proper museum. You know, just because it challenges our notion of a museum doesn't mean that it's a proper museum. I was trying to, I think I said that, Gino has context. I mean, he's like at the forefront. European museum directors go to his museum because they want to learn from it. Also, I mean, this is, we have the internet, we have social networks. I mean, the world is not at this point. So, I'm sorry if I created that understanding that I'm going anywhere to teach anyone anything. That's not the case. I'm interested in making a museum in a school in Berlin, for instance, and I'm using my opportunities like the one in Salvador to learn, because I want to create a space for the artists. I want to create a space it's a very egotistical endeavor, and I'm making this very clear. Yeah.
Thank you for this clarification.
Yeah. I mean, if you ask an Iranian about Kafka, they will be able to tell, an Iranian intellectual about Kafka, they will be able to tell you a lot. If you ask someone from New Delhi about Nietzsche, they will be able to tell you something. We don't know the single first thing. There's also a part of this relation of power within colonialism means that the colonized have so much more knowledge about the colonizer than the other way around.